Hello, this is Ethan Whitrock, and today we're going to go over the basics of Final Cut Pro 10. Specifically, we'll be using Final Cut Pro 10.3. Final Cut 10 is a non-linear editing software, which is to say that it is a click and drag style editing software. You don't have to start at the beginning and end at the end. You can technically be clicking and dragging, moving things around throughout your timeline. We'll talk about how video is like cake and audio is like soup, and basically go into the reasons why the edit decisions you make are important. Both campuses have spaces in the libraries. At St. Ben's, it's the Creative Lab. At St. John's, it's in the Learning Commons Lab. These spaces are outfitted with iMacs that have Final Cut, Adobe Premiere, iMovie, a lot of options for you when it comes to working with multimedia. The one that we especially are able to support is Final Cut 10. Saving is the number one and probably number two major issues that students run into when it comes to working with videos. You need to be using a portable hard drive if you're working on a project for Final Cut. Because the files are so big and because quite often you will have a hard time finishing projects in a single session, using the portable hard drive allows you to move from computer to computer or even from campus to campus without running into any problems. And saving with Final Cut 10 is a little bit more complex because it's based upon where the original library, where your original project is being saved, rather than clicking File and hitting Save every time. Final Cut Pro actually saves automatically, so that saves a lot of headaches about worrying about having to save every 5 minutes or anything like that. But it means that you need to open up your project from the same location every time in order to make sure that that path isn't saving locally to the computer. By getting a portable hard drive from Media, you immediately have certain files that are actually going to be located on the drive itself that'll help you with your editing project. I'm going to plug in my Samsung portable hard drive, and it'll pop up here on my desktop. If for any reason it doesn't, you can always go under the Finder option and actually pull up the drive itself. Here it is, Comp 144. Most will have an inventory number similar to this. When I double click on it, it opens up with 3 folders and a bundle or a library, a Final Cut library. You'll see the purple 4-square icon as in a project folder. It essentially acts like a smart folder where all of your assets, where all of your edit decisions are being stored. So on this portable hard drive, just like any portable hard drive that you would check out for a video project, you'll have a couple of folders that you'll be able to use, a combination of assets, resources, training materials, and then also a finished videos folder, which currently has nothing in it. This is where we'd like you to save your files when you export your finished videos. Once you export a final version of your video, it is a static form. It is flat, whereas all the layers that you were working with while you were editing made it so you could click and drag and move things around. Once you export, it is permanent. We would ask that you put drafts and your final versions inside this finished videos folder. Mark things with dates is usually a good way to keep track of which version you're working with. And I often use the word draft in capital letters if I'm looking at a draft to make sure that I don't accidentally turn in the wrong video or so that someone doesn't get confused when they're looking through my files. It's also not a bad idea to delete your drafts after you've exported an updated version. Under Media Assets, we have a series of folders that are available to you. We often refer to them as royalty-free, but actually we've paid a license, or in some cases we've actually created the original content, which means that we're a copyright holder. There's a lot of information involving copyright that is going to be beneficial to you as a content producer. The big things that we want you to be aware of is that if you do not own it, if you did not create it, and ultimately if you don't hold the copyright for it, we would encourage you not to use it without explicit written permission from the copyright holder. For the sake of most video classes and for the sake of most video projects, we would encourage you to use the royalty-free music, the music that we have access to by means of our license, and you won't have to worry about it. Meanwhile, if you are hoping to use something specifically produced by, for example, a student, or if it was produced by a band, you would want to contact them directly. And often they're not even necessarily the ones that hold the copyright. If they've published, it's often the publisher who owns the copyright. So there's a lot of complexity that'll come into play if you're using someone else's stuff. Remember that at the end of this process, these same laws, these same copyright protections will then be protecting you because your original content is then copywritten so that it is your property. and people would potentially have to get your permission, or even potentially would have to pay for rights to use your work. So here's what's in your media assets folder. We have graphics, which includes some overlay graphics from the institution. We also have some photos. And our exercise project focuses on pottery by Richard Bresnahan. So we have a few images of Richard, and we also have a shot of St. John's. Royalty-free music. Now, the royalty-free music folder breaks down into 3 separate collections that you have access to. The broadcast elements is from a while ago. The iLife jingles is actually some of the standard music that comes with an Apple computer. And then Soundtracks Pro, which is probably some of the more professional options here, allow you to kind of go through and find different versions that would be either shorter or longer. You'll see medium, short, long for some of the versions. And there's a wide range. Any of the music in our royalty-free music folder is available to you to use for sake of a video project. If you're being especially sensitive to the attribution side of citing your sources, especially during the credits of your video, you might list which song you're using and where it's from. A few other royalty-free options you have available to you are the sound effects. The sound effects include a wide range of things from ambiance to background noise to hokey sound effects. A lot of options for you. And then finally, video B-roll. Now, the video B-roll also is based around pottery. So you'll find that there's a few different options here. Each of these clips has background noise to them as well. So during the editing process, we may need to remove that just to make sure that we don't have any unnecessary sound in our clips. It also includes an interview with Richard here.
I'm Richard Bresnahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University.
And in between the clips are 1-second black slates. These clips are what we use in order to do an exercise with the video editing software. They should come on any portable hard drive that's checked out through Media Services. And if they aren't there for any reason, you can always contact us and we can make sure that you have the files that you need for sake of this project. In our Media Resources folder, you have a few different resources that you'll find. At the very top, you have a few links that will bring you to different websites. The top one is Media Services website, which will bring you to the main Media Services website. We have a video that goes over the basics of what's on this site and how it might benefit you for the sake of your project as a different YouTube video. Another one you have is the Media Tutorials video, and this is actually the YouTube playlist that includes this video and a few others as far as training yourself on how to use different equipment and different software through CSB+SJU. Photography collections. So this includes archives at St. Ben's, archives at St. John's, and then the asset bank through the marketing and communications. If you're looking for very high quality professional or archival historical images, these 3 links will bring you to websites that would allow you to access different images from St. Ben's and St. John's. Professional tutorials, separate from the media tutorial videos that we create in-house, this would include lynda.com. Lynda.com is professional grade video tutorials on everything from Final Cut Pro to everything in Adobe to communication skill sets. Lynda.com is a great resource for intermediate and advanced level video producers and people who use technology, as it'll allow you to teach yourself how to do a lot of the basics and even more of the advanced work as well. If you're using the release form, you can have people sign it as a way of making sure that you have written permission to interview them or to use their image in a video that you're creating. You have a wide range of student media groups that produce content on campus. Check them out. They're a great way to learn these skills. It's also a great way to use these skills while you're here at St. Ben's and St. John's. All right, so those are the 3 folders that you have that come standard with your portable hard drive. Finally is the video project library. Final Cut Pro projects are actually saved as these purple icon libraries as a way of making sure that all of your files, all of your folders, all of your edit decisions are being saved in the same place. If you opened this, for example, to show package contents, you would see the full breakdown of what's actually in these smart folders. For all intents and purposes, you really shouldn't have to do anything like that. You can always ask media if you are running into problems when it comes to saving or where your files are actually being saved. But if you can take anything away from this introduction into Final Cut, the big thing is that saving is where people run into problems, and you can avoid those problems entirely if you open up from your portable hard drive every time you want to open Final Cut. So I double click on my portable hard drive. It opens up with these 3 folders in the library. I can then double click on that video project folder and it will open up Final Cut for me. As Final Cut opens up, you'll see over on the far left, here it makes reference to video project and any events that I have inside of it. Now, if you have any other folders that pop up that aren't video project, that are not your project, this is the first thing you want to do. Right-click and close library. Make sure the only library that you're working on is yours. This is where people can potentially run into problems where they're saving in the wrong library, or even if you open it and you see one, it often means that someone has saved locally to the actual computer itself rather than to the portable hard drive. The second thing to do after closing out anyone else's projects would be to check out under Window. And you have a tab here called Workspaces, which is basically the layout of Final Cut, and you can put it back to default. That makes it so that every time you open up Final Cut, especially if it doesn't look the way that you would recognize it, allows you to go back to kind of the standard default layout. All right, so this is the standard interface for Final Cut Pro 10. To the far left, we have our event library, which includes our events, our projects, specifically the libraries, and kind of helps you break down the organizational structure of what is in Final Cut 10. Next to that is the event browser, where your projects and your imported clips will be able to be kind of browsed through. Then you have your viewer, which is where you'll view your project as you're working on it and any of your clips in your browser. And then we have the inspector here. I can turn the inspector on and off with this. The inspector is going to be the individual settings and clip preferences of any part of the project that you're working on. Finally, underneath that, and this is where your project will actually be built, is your timeline. Your timeline is where you're going to click and drag all of your clips, and this is where you'll actually construct the video itself. The process for collecting, capturing, and saving media will be covered in a separate video, specifically because some people are pulling in from smartphones, some from camcorders, some will be using DSLR SD cards. But the big thing that you want to know, though, is that the importing process is pretty similar overall, especially just in the idea of where you want those original files to be, and that would be in that library itself. We'll go over how to do that here as we import our files from the drive. So I'm going to right-click in this main area. You can also go under File and Import. So Import Media. And here I'm going to go to my portable hard drive, which is Comp 144. I can go under Media Assets. I can either double-click on it or click the arrow next to it. I have Video B-roll. I'll double-click. And I'm actually going to want to import all of these clips. You can either click and drag to select all of them. Otherwise, I can select the very top one and then scroll down, hold down Shift, and click again to select them all. So if number one priority for this video was to make sure that you always open up from the portable hard drive, always open Final Cut from that library that's in your portable hard drive, number 2 is this. You want to copy to the library. Your files, you have 2 options. Usually one is copy to library, one is leave files in place. If you copy to library, it is unlikely you will run into any problems when it comes to saving. That smart folder then will have all of those files, even though some of them will be redundant, in that location. And if your project is relatively small, that won't be a problem as far as file size is concerned. So copy to library and you will avoid a lot of the saving issues that people seem to run into. Okay, so I'm copying to library. I'm just going to import all. Note, all of these files now have appeared in my browser. So all the clips that I'm going to be working with. If I want to see the length of them or anything like that, there's an option up here that allows you to actually make the clips either smaller or to increase them based upon their length. So some of these clips are, for example, longer than others. The interview, for example, is actually noticeably longer than the other clips. All right, so number 1 was saving, number 2 was saving. Number 3, as far as the things that you really want to remember about editing with Final Cut, is the process of editing itself. So when it comes to editing with Final Cut, audio and video is like cake, audio is like soup. The reason I say this is because video is like cake in the sense that you pile layers on top of each other. We're going to go over that right now. So to start the editing process, I'm going to find the clips that I want to use and pull down onto my timeline. I can start by clicking and finding portions of, say, the interview. So I'll go to the very beginning here. I'm clicking actually on the clip itself. And then I can use the space bar in order to hit play. You also have this ability to click as well on your, just beneath the viewer.
I'm Richard Brestahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University.
Okay, so that's the first clip that I want to use. There's 2 ways to do this. One way would be to just click and drag this yellow bar in order to find the portion that I want to use. You'll see actually, there I can see actually where I wanted to click and drag. The other option is to use the I and the O key on your keyboard. I marks an in point.
And the artist in residence of...
I'm actually going to go to the very beginning because it's getting to be a little too small, so I'm going to zoom in. Sometimes that makes it a bit easier to work with. Okay, at the very beginning, marking an I.
I'm Richard Brestahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University.
And I mark an O, which would be my out point. I can now click and drag that clip down onto my timeline and drop. When I clicked and dragged and dropped it there, now you're seeing the clip itself and the audio waveform that's attached to it. I can click and drag on my timeline to the very beginning. I'll hit play.
I'm Richard Brestahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University.
Okay, so now I'll find some more clips to work with. Okay, I have a second clip, and then we'll find a third clip here. Marking an out point. And then a final portion. Click, drag, and drop. Okay, so I have a portion of the interview now that I've put next to each other on my timeline. I can hit play and take a look.
I'm Richard Brestahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University. We talked about porcelain inlay because that's a very durable, ancient form of creating pattern. So it's not going to wear away. Even if the piece is broken, the patterns stay because they are in the clay. I could do about 12 a day, and that that was not what I had expected, I guess. Okay, there we go. Well done. Tea time.
All right, so even though it's just 4 clips and there's nothing on top of it, there's no music or anything like that, it's technically clips from his interview, but I would encourage you then at this point to start adding B-roll. And A-roll and B-roll are basically 2 different types of clips that you're going to be working with. A-roll is often your interview, it's often the narrative, it's often the story itself, whereas the B-roll is often kind of complementary visual images, whether it be stock footage or whether it be images of, like in this case, campus or of him working with clay or of the pots in general. So if you hear us refer to A-roll and B-roll, A-roll is your story, B-roll is sort of your stock footage. So we'll start finding some video clips from the stock footage that we want to use. There I can see him pointing to it. I'll hit in. Just a couple of seconds, mark an out point, click drag. And I'm going to drop it on areas in between transitions, so in between clips, as sort of a way of covering up the jump to another clip. Let's see, I'm going to find a few more B-roll clips to work with. And this is a little bit of a longer clip, so I'm going to throw a few pieces of B-roll there to kind of make it a bit more interesting, to help break it up a little bit. And as much as possible, I'm going to actually try to match the content of what he's talking about with the images that I'm showing. So I know he's talking about working with some of the stamps, so I can show the stamps as he's talking about them. Next, I'll find another clip of him working with the stamps. This next image is further away from him, might be a good one to either end with or begin with. We'll often talk about kind of establishing shots And this is kind of a nice option for you. What I'll do is I'll find the portion of it that I like. Here he's working with the pot, marking an in point. So I'll use the establishing shot actually at the very beginning as a way to kind of help set the scene. I'm going to drop it actually next to him rather than put it on top of him, so that'll be the content before he starts talking. Dropping that in. Notice how it pushed everything over. When you drop a clip in front of other clips with Final Cut, as long as you're using the select tool, it'll actually push everything over. A final clip, he was talking about T, so we'll go ahead and hit an in point. And we'll let this one be a little bit longer because we'll fade that one out eventually. Mark an out point. Click, drag, and drop it onto my timeline as well. All right. So we've added clips to our video. Next, we'll talk about some of the tools that come into play now with the editing process. So we've been using the select tool up until this point. The select tool allows you to kind of click and drag clips down onto your timeline. For the most part, it is the dominant tool that you end up using when it comes to editing. Some of the other ones, for example, trim. Trim ends up being automatic so that you are able to click on the very end of a clip. You see how my cursor changes, and it allows me to click and trim the image depending upon if I have footage to work with. So for example, if I want this clip to be a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, I can use the trim option to do that. The other way of getting around that and making your clips either shorter or to separate them out is to use the blade tool. So the traditional way of editing would have been to actually physically cut pieces of film and secure them together. This harkens back to that, but the blade tool functions as a way of actually separating clips. So in this case, if I wanted to take a portion of this clip and cut, I can literally find exactly the spot where I'm interested in cutting and clicking there, and it separates the two clips. Note that this clip with the stamp is now two separate clips. At that point, I can then move back to my select tool, select that one clip, move that to a different location, or even delete it. I'll use my trim tool again to kind of go back to where it was at. Another option would be to use the range selection. Range selection especially comes in handy if you're trying to control portions of your audio levels. We're going to notice that especially once we start working with some of the music here. Those are the primary tools that we want to encourage you to use. There would potentially be opportunities to use zoom and the hand tools or even position, but for an introduction to Final Cut, your primary tools are going to be select, trim, range selection, and blade. All right. So we're looking at our video right now. It's sitting at about a little over 45 seconds. The clips are pretty small though, so I want to show you really quickly how to actually adjust the size of them. Similar to up here where we were able to change the clips inside of our browser, we can do the same thing on the timeline here. So there's actually a little button here that'll allow you to change how your timeline looks. And in this case, I actually want it to go across the screen so that it's as long as it can be. So I'm just making it a little bit longer. I can then scroll back a bit, and there I can see more of my timeline. If you wanted to, for example, see the audio waveforms a bit more, there's a few different options as far as the visual representation of your clips, or you can even make them a little bit wider so that you can see more. So next, let's pull in some photos and music. So I'm going to right-click, import media, and we'll import a few different things. Going back to my media assets, I have photos, graphics, and also music to consider that I could pull in for the sake of this project. I'm going to start by pulling in some photos. Here I have a photo of St. John's. I'm going to pull in that one, making sure I'm copying to library, import. There it pops up in my browser. I'm going to right-click, import. This time I'm going to pull in a graphic, so I'm going to go to Graphics. And I'll find the image, St. Ben's and St. John's, copy to library, import. Next, in royalty-free music, I'm going to grab a clip. If you wanted to preview some of this, you could actually hit the space bar so you can listen to it before you choose to import it. You don't want to import all of them. If you import all of them, you're going to have hundreds of clips that you need to navigate through in your browser. It makes it much easier if you figure out which clips you're hoping to use and then just specifically import those. In this case, I have, and I can see how long some of these are. This is 7 seconds. Here, this one's 1:30. I'll have to cut this one down, but I'll use this one, Gentle Family, and import selected. Note that the music presents itself as a waveform in my browser here. I'm actually going to make things a little bit smaller so I can see things. There I've got my photo, here I've got my graphic, and then I've got my music along with my B-roll and interview from before. Okay, I'm going to take this photo of St. John's and actually put this on top of part of the establishing shot I have of Richard working in the studio. I'm going to trim it and make it a little bit shorter so that it's we see the image of St. John's. Then I'm going to take the graphic I have and drop that on top of that image of St. John's. I'll trim that up again as well. So now when I'm looking at it, now I have to adjust the ratio, but it's a good demonstration of the layers that come into effect. So we're talking about layers as being, video is cake. This is that, the lettering on top of frosting on top of the base cake itself, for example. Okay. Next, I'm going to find the music. I'm going to grab the music and bring that underneath my timeline and just drop it underneath all of the video. It's a little bit longer than I need it to be, so I can always trim it by just grabbing the very end and bringing it a little bit closer to the length that I need it for the sake of the video. Puts it at about 50 seconds. All right. I have graphics, I have photos, I have B-roll, I have my interview, and I have music. Let's take a quick listen. You hear that background noise? You can barely hear Richard. Okay, so we've got visuals working for us, but we need to now pay a little bit more attention to the audio. In my experience and also with my advice, I would tell you to spend as much time on the audio as you can because your audio is your handwriting. And if your handwriting can't be understood, quite often the content or the story or the narrative is often missing its key component to being useful. So I would tell you to definitely give audio its fair share of your attention. And here's some of the tools that you'll want to use in order to do that. So we talked about the range selection. The range selection is a way to select portions of the audio that you want to lower or raise. The other factor that is simple enough is that you can lower the volume of the audio just by clicking and dragging in that audio waveform area. So for example, all these clips that I've imported, all that B-roll, it has background sound to it. I mean, here you can listen very... There you can hear the background noise. If I want to get rid of that, how I'm going to do that is actually just by clicking, dragging, and lowering it to nothing. So we'll get rid of all that background noise that we don't need of all these different clips. This will come up with your clips. If you video record things that are happening, for example, in the Reef or in Gretzky dining, you'll have a lot of background noise that you may not want in your clip because it'll compete with your interview, it'll compete with your music. Meanwhile, if it's something, for example, where you're outside in the Arboretum and you're video recording and you can hear birds in the background chirping or you can hear the wind blowing and it's not completely muffled, you might want to use some of that as some of your way of telling your story. So nat sound or natural sound is sometimes good, sometimes bad. This is where the soup side of things comes into play. So if video is cake, audio is soup. Audio is a mixture and a blend. Sometimes you want certain features to be there. Sometimes you want to get rid of them entirely. Sometimes you want them just a little bit. So you heard just a little bit ago when we were playing this audio, the music is competing with his interview. It's too loud. It's not that we don't want the music there. It's just that we want it to be a bit more subtle. So what we're going to do, instead of lowering the whole piece of the audio for the music, I'm going to just select a portion of it. And how I'm going to do that is by using the range selection. So I grab the range selection tool, and I'm going to click and drag just the portion of it, which is when he's speaking, and bring that volume down a little bit. Not down to nothing, just down a little bit. Now, as I clicked and dragged it down, and I click away from it, it created these little dots, which are edit decisions. These are keyframes. And by moving those, I changed the waveform. I changed where it lowers and raises. So, for example, I'm going to lower it before he starts talking, and then I'm going to have it raise after he's done talking. Let's take a listen.
I am the artist in residence of St. John's University.
It might still be a little loud. I'm going to bring it down just a couple more notches.
I'm Richard Bresnahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University.
Okay, so that's a little bit better. It doesn't compete as badly, and I can hear him a lot more clearly than I could if I was just having the audio of the music playing at full blast. Other ways to create these little edit decisions other than using the range selection tool is to actually hold down the Alt or the Option key, and you can click and it will create these little keyframes. I'm going to go ahead and edit and undo. This is probably the most important tool that you'll learn about. Make sure to use edit, undo when you've made mistakes or if you've accidentally deleted things. Okay, so we've talked about using the range selection. We've talked about using the keyframe option by holding down Alt or Option and then clicking. The other way that you can control the audio is that there's little fades that appear at the beginning and end of each clip. These little fades appear just by if you hover over them. What they do is they create kind of a fade in or a fade out. They create a fade in or a fade out. I'm going to slowly fade in the music. I'm also going to add a fade here because I can hear a breath in at the beginning when he starts speaking, and that just kind of helps smooth some of the edges of your audio. So here I'm going to add that to a few more places just so that it kind of makes things sound a little bit better. Here too, I could technically put them in between each clip. The big place where I want to make sure I have one here is that right now my audio ends very abruptly. That I want the music to fade out, and this would be the way to do it. Is I can just click this, drag this all the way here so that it very slowly fades out.
Tea time.
So now the audio fades, which is kind of nice. Okay, next we're going to go over some of our clips and how we're going to be able to change the specific preferences about them. So for example, our photo here doesn't fully stretch across the screen. How we're going to change that is by clicking on the clip and then viewing it in the inspector. So the inspector pops up by clicking this little tab here over in the top right corner. Your video, audio, and other basic information is all in the inspector, and it's going to be how you kind of control the preferences and settings of your individual clips. From a practical standpoint, say for example I have this photo that's on top of a video clip, it's not fully stretched across, and then I also have a graphic that's a little too far stretched across. Some of that stuff is going to be controlled by using the inspector. I've clicked on my photo, and what I can do, and there's a few options here, I can actually control, for example, the scale of it in general just by increasing the scale. There it stretches across, so that's an easy way to do it. But it remains static if I do that. So one of the options that you'll probably end up using a certain amount, especially with still frame images, is the Ken Burns effect. It's a cropping option. So under crop, you'll find here trim Ken Burns. Ken Burns is a famous documentary maker who has made pieces, for example, about like the Civil War, and there's not a lot of video when it comes to the Civil War, so he ends up using this effect that puts a slight amount of movement on the images, slow zoom in, slow zoom out, slow tilt to the left or right, in order to create movement on still images. So here's what that did. The Ken Burns effect automatically detects and kind of creates something. So there you can see it kind of slowly zooming in. Now if I want to control what that zoom looks like, I can click here. I have the Ken Burns effect. I click here, which is the ability to actually see where the effect is beginning and ending. And what that does is it gives me a green square and a red square. That's the beginning point and the end point of my of that effect. So I'm going to actually make the end point a little bit bigger so that it doesn't have as drastic of a zoom in. And I'll center it a little bit more. I can see where that image is in the middle. I'll take my green one. I'll put that a little bit more central as well so that it's a bit slower of a zoom because, I mean, as much time as you give it is how long it'll take to get there. So then once that's done, I can click Done, and we'll take a look at how that image is looking. A little bit of a slower zoom into the bell banner there. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show you then was I'll click on the graphic, and you remember how I had changed the scale of it. So I can go to Transform, here's my scale option, and I can make it smaller. Now say for example I want that to appear on the road, the other option here I have would be the Transform option. And you can use this on any video, photo, or graphic clip. I click on that, it appears and I can then click and drag. You see the little circle in the middle, or I could actually just click and drag any portion of it and move it to where I want it to go. I could put it in the sky, but then you've got white on white. It becomes harder to see. Meanwhile, if I put it here on the road, put it a little bit there, I'll click done, then my image will pop up there at the base. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. There we go. Video is coming together quick. So the inspector also controls things like your opacity, any of the effects, any of the filters that you add to your clips. They're all going to appear here in the inspector, and your ability to control those preferences or settings individually are all going to be in this area. Adding transitions. So over on the right side of the screen, you have two tabs here. One is your transitions, one is your effects. So we're going to go over transitions here first. There's a lot of different transitions you can use. Some of them are actually quite hokey. Some of them work well, and if you if you use it at the right time and if you use it in the right way, it'll look very tasteful. I think in general, when it comes to modern editing, we're seeing a bit of a transition away from using a lot of transitions, but the ones that still are pretty classic that are used a lot would be under, I think, dissolves. So here you have a cross dissolve, which is just sort of a fade from one image to another, a fade to color, which dip to black, and it'll come back up as a different image. And then we also have flow, which is similar to the morph option on Adobe Premiere. This could be handy, especially if you're trying to edit between clips of the same interview, just because it will help kind of detect and morph between one image to another. Okay, so I'm going to use the fade to color to actually fade, for example, to black here at the very end of my video. I'll click and drag and drop it on my piece. Here's what this looks like now.
Tea time.
See, it faded to black before it went to the B-roll, and then it'll fade to black here at the very end. Now say I want that fade to be a little bit longer, I can actually click and drag and make it so that's a slow fade to black.
Tea time.
There we go. The other options would be things like cross dissolve. I'll click and drag and drop a few of those in. I can make those shorter or longer. So let's take a quick look.
So it's not going to wear away. Even if the piece is broken, the patterns stay because they...
I've added a flash transition as well, just to see a few different variations. So here I've got where it'll cross dissolve.
That was not what I had expected, I guess.
Flash transition.
Okay. There we go. Well done.
And then a fade to black.
Tea time.
So the transitions can kind of help add some flow to your video. It can help make it so that there's not too awkward of changes between your clips. And they're a nice option to use to make your video look a bit more professional. Okay, so next we have our effects. So there's a lot of different effects that you're going to be able to use. Some of them are for the sake of adding kind of a style to your images. A lot of different options in terms of filters to add different types of effects. The most common one that's used is color correction. And color correction helps make it so that you are able to adjust some of your color tones, your contrast, your exposure. And it can come in quite handy, especially if you've shot something that might be outside, which especially can be blue light if it's in the shade or if it's overcast, versus something that you've shot inside, which might have some of those more warmer toned light sources. Color correction can be added by clicking and dragging it and dropping it on a clip. So for example, I'll do that here with this pottery bowl. I click on the clip, and as I said before, in the inspector now, the color correction pops up. I have a little arrow here where I can then control the features of the color correction. So for example, I could increase the saturation and make the colors a bit more pronounced, especially for the darker or the lighter tones. If you want to just make it very simple, you can actually grab the dial next to it and bring them up or bring them down. Doing too much of this, of course, can make it look strange. I mean, here, for example, with the exposure side of it, I could make it a little bit more than it needs to be. But meanwhile, if I bring it down a little bit, and I go back, you can see the difference just by turning it on or off. It can help make sure that your video and your photos are the similar temperature that they should be. So there's transitions, there's effects. The other thing that you can also add would be things like, for example, title graphics. Up in the top left corner, you have your videos, which will ultimately be all of your libraries. You can click on that. Next to that, I would encourage you to stay away from, which is importing from the internal computer. So it'll be your photos and your music, but we're importing photos and music from the drive. So we're right-clicking and importing media. So you won't have to use this second tab. This third tab, though, is titles and generator. Now, when it comes to titles, this is how you're going to add kind of some of your basic text items to your video. You also have some pre-built stuff, like for example, here you can see the Universal Studios kind of style look. You also have some three-dimensional images and, for example, lower thirds that you can add. Make sure to go through here and see what's available to you. Okay, so I'm going to bring a basic title down onto my timeline. I'll drop it right here, and I'm going to actually trim it up so that it's just at the very beginning. I'll click it and call it Pottery with Richard. I'll increase the size, and it's a little bit hard to see, so I'm even going to add an outline. I'll click Outline here. Now the outline automatically adds as red, so I want it to be black. I'm going to just check out some of the additional preferences here. Change it to black. I'll increase the width. And you can see a little bit more clearly now. I'll add a blur to it. Oh, I have it highlighted, so that's not how it'll look. It'll look like this. So Pottery with Richard. I'll put that like over in the corner. So that's my basic title there for the beginning of my video. And then the other one that we want to encourage you to consider using would be like lower thirds. And lower thirds would be your titles or your names that you're adding to your interviews. So I'm going to grab the lower third one and drop that here. And then I'm going to trim it just so that it's just as much as I need. Okay, so I've added the title. I'm just clicking on that and changing the information. I'm going to move it from the left to the right. I can do that in two ways. I can either click and drag the individual words themselves. Otherwise, what I can do is actually grab it as a video, kind of like we did earlier with some of the other clips, and click and drag it over. So I've brought my lower third over to the far right. Let's take a look at how these titles are looking so far.
St. John's University.
All right. So those are the basics for titles. We'll take a quick look at generators as well. The generators can be useful, especially if you're working with a green screen or if you want to create a backdrop. The other thing too is that you have this custom slug or custom slate, which allows you to create space. And the reason why it might be helpful sometimes is that, say for example, I want to add a transition to this clip. If I'm not careful, what ends up happening is that it'll actually bleed through. So for example, if I have a fade to color clip on this, on my beginning clip of St. John's, it's actually going to show the image that was underneath it at first. Now I could delete the image there, but otherwise if I put this custom slate here, I can move that so it's just underneath this image of St. John's so that when I'm showing the very beginning of my video, it doesn't accidentally appear. These come in handy. I use them quite a bit, especially when I'm trying to put some space in between clips. If you end up using a green screen, what you can do is actually go to the effects. One of the options you have is keying, and keying is often the way that you would end up removing green or blue or some other significant color from an image. This would allow you then to click, drag, drop it, and it will remove the color that it detects as being the one that you're trying to use for the keying function. Certain student media groups and certain student assignments might call for using a green screen in order to put that person in a different location than they would normally be. There's a lot of very creative ways that you can potentially use a green screen option, and we'd encourage you to try using it. The keying option is really the big way to make it work, though, and then you can turn that on and off in your inspector, or you can click and delete to remove it. The other option that we might show you is changing your speed. So some people like to speed up their clips, some people like to slow them down. I'm going to do that actually with the stamp option right here. So what I can do is I can click on my clip. I have a little timing tab that pops up here. I can slow it down or speed it up. I'll speed it up by 2. Now I can actually speed it up much more, or much faster or much slower just by clicking and dragging this. So see how it goes from like 300% or even 100%. 100% is going to be the normal option. We'll do about 200%, and you'll see the difference here.
The piece is broken, the patterns stay because they are in the clay.
Now, changing the speed of your clip can be very helpful, especially if you're trying to reduce the amount of time that you're using to demonstrate something or to visually show something. But other than that, you can use it as a stylistic choice to speed up interviews if you're trying to get a certain effect, or to speed up, for example, music if you want to change the tempo or to create a certain feel to a piece. So we've added transitions, we've added filters, we have music, we have B-roll, we have photos, we've added keyframing effects. Let's take a look at how our video is looking.
I'm Richard Brestnahan, the artist in residence of St. John's University. We talked about porcelain inlay because that's a very durable, ancient form of creating pattern. So it's not going to wear away. Even if the piece is broken, the patterns stay because they are in the clay. I could do about 12 a day, and that that was not what I had expected, I guess. Okay, there we go, well done. Tea time.
All right, so our video is done. We may want to add some credits to the very end. There's a few different options when it comes to adding credits. The scrolling credits is probably the most common one, but you want to make sure that you give credit to your crew. You want to make sure that you give attribution to any resources you've used that weren't originally produced by you. And it's always a good idea, too, to say thanks to maybe any individuals who helped you produce the video that weren't part of your crew. If you're doing something of a video essay or something that includes a certain amount of data, you'll want to include your sources in the credits as well. Make sure that you clearly reference where your sources are coming from, so that if someone was to watch the video, that they could find those resources and verify or do a fact check on your video. Our final process is going to be exporting the video. By exporting the video, you've essentially hit print. You could make additional changes and actually export it as many times as you choose to. But anytime you hit export, you basically create a static, solid version of that video. Here's how you're going to do that. So I've got my video open on my timeline. I'm going to go up to File. I'm going to go to Share and Master File, or Default. I'm going to scrub through my video. I can see that it's there. Here you can click and actually give it a title. We'll call this was called Pottery with Richard. And I'm going to even put a date for the version after it. So V, and today is September 1st. And then something that we have also suggested to student groups is to put each group member's name in the title so that it's clear what we're looking at. We want to make sure that you also include your names in the credits. You might even have it at the very beginning as saying who it was produced by. But we want to make sure that when we're looking at one of these videos that we know who made it, especially if it's being graded for any type of an assignment. After the info option, I can click settings, and here's the important part. So the normal thing that people would do when exporting a video would be to export a video and audio. The problem is that this exports as a QuickTime file. It is more convenient actually for everyone if you export as an MP4. This is a bit more of a universal video format. It allows you to easily upload to YouTube. It also can be played back on PC and Mac without much of an issue, and it usually is a smaller file size. So computer is the format that you want to use. As far as video codec is concerned, I would suggest doing the better quality. And then as resolution is concerned, you want to do as high as you possibly can. Your project should be 1920, 1080, or 1280, 720. Those really should be the only resolutions that you're working with when it comes to these types of video assignments. And then the rest of it, you should be good. And then the next, it'll say kind of approximate how big it'll be. This file is going to be about 124 megabytes. It's pretty big to send via email, so we're going to talk about how you might get that file if you need to share it with someone or if you need to send it to someone. We'll hit next, and then it'll ask me where I want to save it. And if you remember at the beginning of the video, we talked about how your finished videos folder is where you want to save things. So finished videos, Pottery with Richard, version date, and my name, save. Now, as it's exporting, you can actually follow along with importing, exporting, and rendering by clicking this little dial up in the corner that will show you where things are at. When you're importing, you need to make sure to use this dial to keep track of where it's at as far as how far along it is in importing. If you eject it or if you disconnect it before it's done importing, you'll lose your source footage. Same thing can be said while you're exporting. Until this is completely at 100%, your video is not yet fully formed. Once it's done, once it's fully exported, you'll have a single file. It'll be the MP4 with the title that we gave it, and it's done. So we'll just wait for this to finish sharing. All right. So it'll sometimes take several minutes, especially if you're working on a larger project, to export the finished video. But once it's done, it should say share successful. It'll even pop up if you've selected that it should pop up once it's done. I can go ahead and hit close here for now. I'm even going to close this video out, and I'm going to close Final Cut Pro. Go to Final Cut Pro and hit quit Final Cut Pro. Remember how we said at the beginning, there is no file save or anything like that when it comes to Final Cut. It saves automatically as you're working on it, at least the edit decisions. So next time I open up Final Cut from my portable hard drive, it'll bring us back to the project as it was last time I was working on it. Under my finished videos here, I have Pottery with Richard. I can double click on it, or I can just hit spacebar to preview it. I'll go ahead and preview it. It is now a static video. So it is completely, now I would have to, for example, if I needed to edit it from this video itself, I would have to pull this file into Final Cut, cut it up into different pieces, and then change it. But the problem is that you can't do that in the same way you can while you're using the editing software. So for example, I'm not going to be able to separate out the layers. I'm not going to be able to separate out the music from my interview. You need to make those decisions while you're working with the original assets themselves. It's good to remember that you're able to make changes and you're able to adjust your video so long as you still have the Final Cut bundle or that library. Once you've turned in your portable hard drive, we delete the original files that are on your drive. So you might still have access to that finished version that you exported, but you won't be able to make changes to it unless you import it into Final Cut and then actually cut it apart. You won't be able to separate the layers though at that point. So it's one of the reasons why you want to make sure that you have a final finished version as you want it permanently before you turn in your portable hard drive. Now, when it comes to sending these files, it's a little bit big to be sent as an email. We would often recommend that you use OneDrive, which you have as a student. You can upload things to OneDrive and send people links and give them access so that they can download it. You might also be asked to upload it to Canvas as another alternative. You can technically use things like Dropbox and Google Drive, but we want to encourage you to use the sort of official methods of delivering it to your professor or to others in the institution. YouTube is another option as well, where you're able to upload, especially MP4s, to YouTube, and you can send the link then to those you want to share the video with. So this has been an overview of Final Cut 10.3. Please feel that you can always come to those in the library, media, or in IT if you have any questions about using the equipment, using the software, or using any of the facilities in the labs. Making videos using the software and the equipment that we have has never been easier. And we want to make sure that you feel that you have the support and that you have any of the resources that you need in order to be successful. Please feel free to come and talk to us if you have any questions or if you need any help. Our student employees are also trained in on how to use Final Cut Pro and should be able to answer any questions you may have. Thanks very much.